It's a curious thing, really. Back in the frostbitten winters of the colonial Northeast, when lake ice could moan loud enough to rattle your molars, early settlers didn't just sleep beneath blankets. They slept beneath ground. Not in coffins, mind you. This isn't that kind of story. They nestled quietly in dugouts, root cellars, and semi-subterranean homes called pit houses. These were part bedroom, part potato bin, part makeshift insulation experiment, and entirely better than freezing to death, which frankly seemed a bit out of season for your average 18th century farmer. The logic was simple and delightfully unglamorous. The ground, you see, maintains a remarkably stable temperature just below the surface, while the wind above wailed like a banshee and frostbite was developing social ties with your earlobes. The cozy soil below hovered in the polite 40s Fahrenheit. Chilly, yes, but far better than the abominable zeros above. So imagine, it's January 1702. You're in New England. The snow outside has turned the latrine into a high-stakes expedition. Your axe is frozen into the log pile, and frankly, so are your eyebrows. You look around your cabin. The logs aren't exactly airtight. Every crevice whispers a cold draft sweet nothings into your spine. What do? Naturally, you grab a shovel. Many colonists, especially those building their lives on tight budgets and tighter wool inventories, modified their homes with dugout rooms partially embedded in the ground. Even full log cabins often had a kind of earthen crawl space, which over time became, let's call them bonus levels, lower floors that began as root storage and evolved into unofficial winter suites. But the real champions of cozy survival, the pit houses, these were proper little hobbit holes, dug several feet into the earth, lined with timber or stone, covered over with thatch, bark, or if you were feeling wild, sod. Some had chimneys, though most were cleverly vented through concealed channels that discouraged both smoke inhalation and unwanted guests. Like bears. Yes, that happened. No, we're not talking about it before bedtime. If the idea of retreating underground for warmth makes you feel faintly molish, you'd be in good company. Indigenous groups across North America, like the Mandan tribes and many others, had been crafting their own versions of these earthen beauties for generations, long before some clumsy European with frostbite ambitions tried to reinvent the frozen wheel. Interestingly, these early settlers rarely credited native engineering for these life-saving ideas, which is a bit like borrowing your neighbor's perfectly good soup, then acting as if you invented broth. But we know better. And to all the indigenous engineers of yore, thank you. Your mud-walled foresight made it possible for an entire wave of sleep-deprived colonists to dodge hypothermia and snore another night. Now, don't go picturing a damp, rock-covered den. Many pit houses were surprisingly charming. Well, charming if your standards include a dry place to not perish. The floors were often lined with packed earth or bark. Bedding consisted of straw, animal pelts, and whatever blankets Aunt Prudence spun before the sheep went bald. Small hearths kept the cold at bay, and candles, if available, painted the room with an unsteady amber glow, lighting up beams as smoke drifted lazily out the vent like last thoughts at 1 a.m. There's even evidence some families brought the livestock in with them for warmth. That's right. A cow makes a fairly decent radiator when push comes to shove. Perhaps not ideal in the realm of scent, but in the grand colonial game of heat or meat, your average settler chose both. They say necessity is the mother of invention. But out in the icy backwoods, with snow like iron and nights like lead, necessity was more like a grumpy grandmother with a wool-stuffed ladle. and what she demanded was warm toes. So they slept low, closer to the earth, tucked tightly into the underbelly of winter, with frozen stars unseen but not unimagined above. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, as the fire smoulders and the shovel rests gently by the doorway, let's remember, sometimes the path to surviving the coldest seasons isn't up, but ever so slightly down. Snow didn't just fall in early colonial winters. It had a personality, a petty one, cold, loud, and somewhat theatrical. Picture it swirling with flair, determined to wedge itself into every woolen crevice and moral fibre of the weary colonist. Now imagine facing that blizzard with nothing more than flimsy timber walls, drafty windows, and neighbours who believed bathing was a springtime activity. The early settlers had a choice to make during the worst of winter: freeze solid above ground, or take cover like a hibernating raccoon with a taste for smoked eel and deep introspection. By December, the soil had long since frozen into a brittle surface that resisted every effort at cultivation and inspiration. And so, the settlers turned their gaze downward, literally, down toward the earth, or rather, into it. You see, when fireplaces were few, chimneys were more theory than function, and insulation was chiefly achieved by growing a second beard. On top of the first, people became remarkably creative about warmth. Creativity fueled by desperation, frostbite, and the occasional hallucination of warm bread. Cue the concept of the dugout, not to be confused with the baseball kind, though both often featured dirt, splinters, and fervent prayers. These pioneer dwellings were excavated into hillsides, banks, and in some cases, sheer hope. People quite literally lived below the surface in what can best be described as glorified hobbit huts with none of the charm and all of the mildew. The builder would first scout for a slope, the more south-facing, the warmer. Digging down a few feet, they hollowed out a modest chamber, often about the size of a generous pantry or an introvert's wedding party. The walls were packed with earth, the ceiling might be lined with logs and sod, and the door was usually whatever hadn't yet been burned for firewood. One family reportedly repurposed their barn door, and the cow never forgave them. Inside, life was rustic. Candles sputtered like moody teenagers, and beds were layered with fur, blankets, straw, and occasionally a dog, usually named something like Old Scruff or Don't Move, He's Warm. Smoke from the hearth gathered up in the ceiling, forming a cozy choke of heat and eye irritation. Still, it was better than risking frostbite on one's more sentimental bits in an upstairs room near an open window pane. For bodily warmth, piled bodies were not just acceptable, they were often unavoidable. Extended families slept in such tight arrangements that social boundaries ceased to exist. One settler famously wrote, "We are as herring in a barrel and twice as cranky." Personal space was not a colonial concept. Your elbow might wake up in Aunt Mag's face and no one would apologize. It's just how surviving winter worked. Interestingly, while these below-ground shelters were a necessity for ordinary folks, the higher-ups with stone houses and stuffed accounts tended to stay stubbornly above ground, preferring fires, footmen, and hypothermia. But for the majority, cold noses, cold feet, and comically long nightcaps were an everyday reality. There's also the little problem of things that skitter. Mice, of course. Always mice. They treated these earthy huts as winter retreats, booking in for the season, requesting complimentary oats, and nibbling on anything that wasn't nailed down, or even things that were. One diary entry from 1698 reads, simply, "Lost a good mitten to an ungrateful rodent. May his children inherit fleas." And yet, in all this earthy hardship, there was a strange kind of comfort. A low ceiling meant heat didn't flee. Thick sod walls muffled the wind's howling indignation, and being tucked into the earth somehow felt like surrendering to something ancient. People slept soundly down there, not just because it was warmer, but because winters were long, and dreams needed roots. In the fire's faint glow, faces took on gentle shapes, and the day's frozen toil seemed farther away. The snoring was impressive, the air was thick, and the straw occasionally poked. Still, these humble shelters became sanctuaries, grounded, quiet, and wholly practical. And while the legends of icy cold colonial hardships could fill shelves of tavern talk and wool-wrapped lamentations, it's often missed that many settlers chose not to fight the cold head-on, but to sidestep it entirely by going under. We'll drift now, leaving behind cracked clay floors and steaming breath in moonlit dugouts, for something even more mysterious, the ancient whispering wisdom of sleeping in smoke. If you step quietly into the frozen forests of the early 1700s, during one of those wool-gnawing winters that made even the bears re-evaluate their life choices, you might stumble upon something odd. Not a log cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, not a solitary wax-sealed window with candlelight glowing cozily behind it. No, you'd most likely find a half-buried lump in the earth, and maybe a crude wooden sign that says, "Home," sort of. Early settlers, as it turns out, were not interested in building ambitious chalets with second floors and open-concept kitchens. When winter came sweeping down like a poorly planned polar parade, their architectural motto was, "Dig first, decorate never." Enter the glorious tradition of subterranean, snuggling, also known as the Winter Earth Lodge. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't have crown molding, but it was warmish. Ish. Let's drift slowly into one of these humble havens, shall we? Down you go, mind the icy slope, until your boots crunch onto a floor made of dirt, or perhaps some thoughtfully flattened bark panels, smooth enough to sleep on, stiff enough to remind you of your posture problems. The walls rise no higher than a standing beaver, and they're lined with any available insulation, pine boughs, leftover felt hats, and, if you're lucky, a particularly fluffy dog who's been tricked into being a foot warmer. Now, why would one voluntarily sleep in a kind of tree-rooted hobbit hole? Because heat, dear listener. Because heat and survival. Above ground, the wind blew like it had centuries of unresolved bitterness. It ripped through poorly chinked walls, whistled through drafty roofs, and made a mockery of anything resembling a fireplace. Below ground, though, there was a kind of stillness. The earth, seasoned old crone that she is, kept her secrets and her temperature remarkably steady. Dig 4 feet down, and suddenly the air isn't trying to rearrange your skeleton. Even in the depths of winter, the ground maintained a sort of cozy neutrality, staying just around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, as if daring the wind to come get it. Wrap yourself in a badger pelt or two, light a modest fire in a cleverly vented pit, and, well, you might not be toasty, but you were less frozen than you'd be upstairs, which honestly is the standard scale of wilderness comfort. These semi-underground homes, called soddies, dugouts, or with a certain poetic flair, earth-bermed huts, were borrowed from indigenous traditions. In fact, many settler designs mimicked, and frankly, stole outright, the practices of the Mandan, Pawnee, and other Great Plains tribes who had perfected the science of keeping warm centuries earlier without the benefit of a single IKEA instruction manual. The layouts were shockingly smart. Entrances often pointed away from prevailing winds. Roofs were made with timbers laid over frames, dotted with animal hides and layers of dirt. Not a single square foot was wasted. The bed doubled as seating. The cooking pit doubled as not dying. And the chamber pot? Well, let's just say you made peace with your neighbors quickly. For ventilation, a small opening near the ceiling funneled smoke heavenward, although sometimes, and I say this gently, it had other ideas. Nothing says good morning like waking up in a subterranean tarp tent full of lightly smoked squirrel stew and your great aunt wheezing in the corner. During the worst blizzards, these underfoot sanctuaries became places of reluctant coziness. Families knotted up together like spoons in a drawer, sharing warmth, stories, and the occasional game of whose elbow is in my rib cage. And while the air might grow stale and tempers might flare if someone snored at the wrong octave, it was in many ways safer than the fancier cabins folks liked to build above ground. Those had a funny habit of collapsing under the weight of snow or catching fire when candles fell into dry straw for reasons. Even into the 1800s, prairie pioneers continued the tradition, at least until the railroads brought lumber, iron stoves, and a whole new era of above-ground aspirations. But for those earliest winters, when wood was scarce and wolves were uncomfortably social, going underground wasn't just smart, it was practically a lifestyle. And when you lay on that hard-packed earth, wrapped in 100 cotton scraps and the smell of half-cooked beans, you could almost trick yourself into thinking you were back in the womb of the world itself. A little darker, a little smellier, but intimate, honest, relentlessly humble. Sometimes surviving the cold meant surrendering luxury, stepping not forward, but downward, into the belly of the land, into warmth, however modest, into a sleep not disturbed by screaming winds or creaking beams, but by the slow drip of melting frost near your nostril. And somewhere, just outside your burrow, the snow kept falling. Let's ease deeper into this wintry tale, where we find the humble technology settlers used to warm their underground rooms without burning the house down. As the icy breath of winter crept around the log corners of a frontier cabin, early settlers of North America found themselves entangled in a nightly struggle, not with wolves or war bands, or even ghosts wailing from hollow trees, but with the simple, stubborn laws of thermodynamics. See, heat rises, naturally. It's one of those facts they didn't have to learn in school, largely because there weren't schools, or heat, or much rising for that matter. But they understood it instinctively. After all, when the fire in the hearth puffed its smoky sides into the air, the warmth floated up, and then vanished through the rafters quicker than a prayer in hurricane season. Now you'd think, if heat rises, wouldn't it be warmer up top? Wouldn't they sleep in lofts, up near the roof? Yes. Good. Logically sound. Disastrously incorrect, because what heat didn't do back then was stay put. Those roofs weren't exactly airtight. Think more barn than bungalow. So the warmth made a short-lived cameo and then waved goodbye to the sleeping family, passing through chinks in the shingles on its way to warm the moon. The floor, meanwhile, the floor, wasn't just floor. It was the final frontier between you and whatever lay below. Dirt, ice, curious raccoons, your pick. Faced with such a chilly architectural reality, many settlers resorted to a peculiar trick, sleeping below the floor. Yes, under. Not in a second bedroom or in an Airbnb dug into the hillside. No, they'd dig shallow pits beneath the cabin itself and bed down into the earth like oversized marmots with a mortgage. This wasn't the luxury of choice, of course. It was a necessity with a pinch of desperation. Being below ground meant protection from winds so sharp they could file your teeth, and insulation from temperatures that chased grown men into bed at 5 p.m. with wool hats and 3 moral regrets. They often called these makeshift burrows earthbeds or dugouts, which sounds sweet, like something Peter Rabbit would do before a nap. But in reality, they were damp, cramped hollows where a family might huddle like seeds in a trembling pod, unsure whether the sound outside was a falling icicle or the disapproval of the local bear. Still, they made the most of it. Blankets were woolen, often scratchy, sometimes damp, occasionally haunted, depending on who had carded the wool. Children would sleep packed together like biscuits in an iron skillet, and parents, most of whom hadn't slept more than 4 hours since the new world got new, would whisper stories as breath fog danced between them like a ghost in a hurry. And then there were the neighbors, the mice, the moles, the occasional skeptical opossum, giving everyone the side-eye at bedtime. There was little dignity in it, but there was warmth, and that counted for everything. Of course, the hearth fire still blazed above, watched lovingly by a cast-iron pot and several pans that had seen greater culinary achievements in dreams than in breakfast. But the real warmth was in the earth, well, about a foot under it, which may explain why so many early homesteaders carried the lingering scent of loam and cooked beans wherever they traveled. Interestingly, this tradition of burrowing didn't originate on the American frontier. It's actually older than some of the stars still shining above your house as you listen now. Across ancient Europe and Central Asia, earth-sheltered dwellings were the go-to move when the thermometer plunged. Vikings, yep. Mongols, certainly. The Celts, they loved a good subterranean snuggle. Back then, it wasn't about style. It was about staying alive. And as it turns out, Mother Earth makes a decent blanket, if a bit lumpy and fond of worms. And so, in the heart of winter, beneath logs and lintels and roof beams too humble to be jealous of, families slept in the very belly of the land, dreaming of spring, of shoes without frostbite, of a future where bedrooms had doors and mattresses didn't grow mushrooms without permission. But that dream was still far off. For now, they lay quietly in the hush of frozen nights, listening to the branches above groan like an old man settling into a cold pew. And as silence stretched deeper than snowdrifts, the settlers knew that sometimes to keep warm, you didn't rise above it all. You curled into the quiet, just under the floorboards, where secrets slept beside you. And speaking of curling into the quiet, let's follow a few flickering candle shadows just beyond the dirt wall and see what cleverness came next in the long, chilly business of staying alive till morning. When the frost set its diamond teeth into the woodlands of early North America, there was one sound you'd never hear, from any settler, anywhere, and that was the calm click of someone ascending a staircase to bed on the second floor. No, that would have been pure madness. An act only rivaled in lunacy by, say, sleeping in a snowdrift or dining with your hat off. Above-ground rooms in winter became less cozy bedroom and more freezer with wallpaper. Lofted ceilings merely gave cold air the freedom to swirl around like it was auditioning for a ghost story. And insulation, that was a French word, and, to be honest, a future luxury. What passed for insulation might have been a soggy bundle of moss, tightly packed with the hopeful desperation of someone pretending that damp weeds could save them from a Canadian January. So, when the snows came, and they came like a relative who overstays their welcome, the settlers went low, literally, into cellars, dugouts, crawl spaces, anywhere the earth might cradle them warmly like a half-hearted hug from nature, because the ground, while not especially talkative, is at least consistent. It maintains a comfortable-ish 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Compare that to an upstairs bedroom, where the only thing lying frozen was hope. One particular settler by the name of Obadiah Twill. Yes, that's an actual old-timey name and not a pillow-stuffing brand. Once wrote in a letter about spending the winter of 1709, huddled beneath his kitchen floorboards, sleeping atop onions and regretting life choices. He called it the winter of spicy tears, but admitted it was warmer than his bedchamber, whose windows had a charming habit of frosting on the inside. The flames from the hearth wouldn't dare climb the stairs. They were penny pinchers when it came to heat distribution. You might imagine that these families slept tucked under quilts with intricate stitching and colonial elegance. And yes, quilts were the pride of any homestead. But beneath the moonlight, they were wielded like tactical thermal shields. Entire families would pile into a single bed. The mattress stuffed with corn husks or straw, depending on the success of the harvest, and bury themselves beneath enough layers to smother a reasonable adult. Add in a dog or three, because everyone knew that a warm dog was nature's original hot water bottle. And if you happened to have a cat, congratulations, you now owned a self-heating face mask. There was even a phrase for this co-sleeping arrangement: 3-dog night. Not just a groovy 70s band, but a temperature-based metric from the time when you judged your bedtime needs by canine quantity. A 1-dog night might be a brisk evening, but a 3-dog night meant survival was no longer optional. And fireplaces, oh the fireplaces, those temperamental, smoke-belching hearts of every cabin. They were noble in theory, but tragic in function. Most of the heat they produced went up the chimney, along with your hopes for symmetrical eyebrows. People would sit so close to the fire that their fronts baked while their backs shivered like damp raccoons. Spinning around was advised, not for crisping evenly, but for basic circulation. Now, let us not forget the children. While today's young ones might complain about socks that don't match, colonial children had the distinct pleasure of waking to find their breath crystallized mid-air, and sometimes their water bucket frozen beside them. It was considered a fine start to the day if one's shirt didn't also need to be thawed with body heat. So the solution was clear: live like groundhogs, build low, sleep lower. Whole families would convert storage rooms into winter sleeping quarters. Cellars, pantries, even root caves with humble shelving groaning under jars of pickled everything. Because if there was one thing 18th century settlers trusted more than their upstairs floorboards, it was a well-preserved beet. Sometimes they'd bring their food supplies to bed with them, not out of affection, but pragmatism. When it's bitterly cold, cuddling a jar of lard is less a sign of madness and more an admission that you value both warmth and hydration. There's even a very questionable tale of a man who used a smoked ham as a pillow. The man claimed it cradled his neck better than a goose feather bolster, though it's unknown if he woke up with mysterious bite marks. Humor aside, these choices weren't eccentric. They were brilliant in their simplicity. Early settlers understood, in ways we've mostly forgotten, that heat wasn't just generated, it was contained, hoarded, fiercely protected like your last biscotti. And so, when the sky went slate grey and the world muffled itself in layers of white, the clever ones didn't just endure. They burrowed, they nested, and they clung to the belly of the earth like hibernating philosophers, armed with quilts, onions, and hope. Now, imagine the silence down there. Just the occasional creak of timber, the gentle bubbling of a pickling jar, the rhythmic breath of humans and hounds tucked in like stacked spoons. In the next soft flicker of our lantern's flame, we'll wander even deeper, beyond warmth, and into how these settlers managed to sing, laugh, and yes, occasionally bake, even in the frostbitten belly of wild new worlds. Beneath a thick quilt of snow, nestled into the elbow of a frozen creek, a group of early settlers whispered good nights inside what could best be described as very cozy dirt. Not because they had an intense fondness for mud, though some likely developed an appreciation, but because, quite simply, warmth trumped pride in the colonial winter survival hierarchy. As it happens, the human instinct to dig when freezing has an impressively long resume. For millennia, people burrowed, built into hillsides, or refurbished abandoned badger dens, though they might not have admitted that part, to stay safe from the cruel bite of winter. By the time European settlers arrived in North America, they quickly realized something unpleasant. Their drop-shouldered homes with charming hand-hewn shingles and thin walls were, how shall we say, aesthetically pleasing and thermally disastrous. The wind had developed hobbies, one of which was slipping through the gaps in log cabins and tickling unsuspecting ankles until they trembled like jelly. So they went underground, literally. Enter the world of the dugout shelter, not to be confused with baseball, or whatever the 1600s version of baseball may have been, likely something with sticks, rocks, and an unjust amount of shouting. A dugout was a burrowed shelter, often carved directly into the side of a slope or hill, ideally one with no recent bare tenants. These burrowed huts were easier to heat and significantly better at insulating against snowstorms. Sometimes they were lined with logs, other times not at all. Furnishings were sparse. If you were rich in straw, you had a mattress. If you were rich in chickens, you had warmth, albeit noisy. One particularly memorable winter account comes from the Midwest, where settlers dug out homes so efficiently that wandering visitors couldn't find them without a guide or accidentally tripping over someone's chimney. A traveling preacher reportedly stood atop someone's roof for a full sermon without realizing he was being listened to from below. The owners politely waited until he finished before gently inviting him in for soup. Inside the dugout was closeness embodied, quite literally. Families often lived shoulder to shoulder, sharing body heat, breath fogging the low ceilings. It was the kind of intimacy that only pioneers or sardines could appreciate. Privacy was out of fashion, survival was in, but the dugout wasn't just the realm of cold desperation. There was ingenuity to it. Folks would craft windows not from glass, which was a luxury, but from oiled paper or translucent animal membranes. Objects that today could get you flagged by a health inspector, but back then were the pinnacle of frontier architectural glamour. During daylight hours, these softly glowing panels turned the earthy little quarters into sacred spaces of yellowy warmth. With stew bubbling on a crude hearth and the walls practically humming with shared stories, the dugout took on the warmth of a hearth-bound womb. Fire maintenance was another matter. Smoky dugouts led to many coughing fits, and ventilation was a game of constant negotiation between not freezing and not waking up smoked like a ham. Chimneys were built low-tech, a hole in the ceiling, perhaps hooded with stones or topped with a hollowed-out log. Breathing, remarkably, was a balancing act, and yet people got cozy. A child might curl up beside the family dog, who was not only beloved but a remarkably effective heat source. Grown-ups wrapped their feet in rags soaked in warm lard to ward off frostbite, a home remedy that worked succinctly and smelled like rendered bacon. Lard-based socks aside, life beneath the surface had its charms. The world above could be tumultuous, a screaming wind, drifting snow, or a neighbor's ox that refused to stop mooing at inconvenient hours. But down below, walls thick with earth muffled the chaos, turning night into something tender, like a song hummed under your breath. Those quiet nights were something special. Candlelight flickered against earthen walls. Shadows danced lazily across ceilings just inches overhead. And one by one, voices dimmed. Not from weariness alone, but from comfort. From the rare and delicate feeling that, despite everything, they were exactly where they needed to be. And as we drift a little deeper beneath the frost-laced ground with them, somewhere between story and silence, our path gently leads us to what came next. When the settlers, their underground domain secured, began to redefine what counted as a front door. By the time January's breath froze the rivers and the trees stood as icicles in disguise, early European settlers in the colder colonies had already retreated from the world above. No more toiling in open fields, no chopping wood by moonlight, no climbing up ladders unless you wanted to become one with the frost. The world up top had become, quite simply, completely unlivable. So what did these survival-savvy souls do? They went down. And no, not in the poetic face your fears, plumb the emotional depths kind of way. I mean literally, into the ground. Let's talk about the earthen refuge of necessity and ingenuity, semi-subterranean shelters, a design forged not by architects who read Latin treatises, but by people with frostbitten toes and a powerful will to not perish mid-blizzard. Imagine this. You're in New England, 1664. Your boots are more holes than leather. Snow stacks against the outside door like a Jehovah's Witness with very poor timing. Gathering firewood has become an Olympic sport, and your breath freezes mid-laugh. So you shuffle, with great care and no small amount of muttered curses, into the family's winter dugout, a half-buried haven carved into the earth itself. It was warmish. It was dim. It smelled faintly of smoked meat, mud, and unwashed optimism. But most importantly, it worked. The earth, you see, is a slow thinker. While the air zips about changing moods faster than a toddler denied jam, the soil maintains a steadier temperature, far more pleasant than the howling blizzards above. 6 feet underground, the ambient temperature could stay around 50 degrees Fahrenheit even in deep winter. Not toasty, but definitely not deathly. The design itself was basic and brilliant. A rectangular pit dug into the ground, lined with logs or stones, roofed with whatever wasn't currently sticking out of someone's snow-covered cabin. Timber, birch bark, thatch, or even sod laced together with frozen dreams. You might call it rudimentary insulation, but we call it pioneer chic. Sometimes, these semi-subterranean wonders went by names like pit houses, earth lodges, or charmingly, dugouts. But don't let the terminology fool you. This wasn't an exclusive colonial strategy cooked up by tight-panted settlers with powdered wigs. Indigenous peoples, particularly the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Pawnee cultures, had mastered earth-based housing for winter long before anyone shouted taxation without representation at a teacup. In fact, colonists often borrowed, some might say enthusiastically took, the design cues from the native communities around them. Observing that your neighbor wasn't frozen stiff in the cabbage patch was, after all, highly motivating. What's even more endearing or concerning, depending on your view, was how communal these spaces tended to be. Families huddled together, not only for warmth, but presumably because no one had invented introversion yet. This arrangement meant personal space became theoretical, and the family dog, the only creature both furry and loyal, was often the favorite pillow. The children, meanwhile, were kept warm by the heat of 7 adjacent siblings and the faint squabble over whose turn it was to hang closest to the hearth. Now, speaking of the hearth, fireplaces in these spaces were carved with all the elegance of kitchen tools fashioned from driftwood. A simple pit in the center, sometimes with a smoke hole above, and other times without, because windows were a luxury and proper chimneys required more bricks than colonial life ever provided. As a result, these spaces could often be a bit smoky. Eyes watered, shirts smelled like roasted squirrel, but spirits stayed marginally warm, especially with a mug of fermented cider passed around like a shared bedtime story. Through it all, there was a kind of comfort in the closeness, in the womb-like stillness of soil and snow, with the crackle of fire and the hiss of melting frost. They rested. Outside, the winds might echo like lost violins, bending the trees into frozen supplicants. But inside, beneath layers of earth and close-knit humanity, life waited quietly for spring. The irony, these fancy fall-into-the-earth lodgings had a peculiar resemblance to something else the settlers were all too familiar with. Graves, yes. The winter dugout had the gentle ambience of a cozy tomb. But unlike actual burial, this brought the promise of longer days, of sunshine returning, of fresh rhubarb and air that didn't bite you. And so, wrapped in wool and wisdom, they kept close to the ground. Because in the coldest months, survival itself depended on sinking just low enough. In the hush of what used to be a housing pit and had now become a home, dreams unfurled beside the hearth. Just above them, snow piled higher still, sealing out the cold, but never the stories. And beneath that low sod roof, the world waited quietly for the next challenge. One that, as you'll soon see, crept on 6 legs and had no respect for earthen walls. In the cold and cranky winters of early colonial life, there existed one great unspoken battle beyond the obvious skirmishes with frostbite and boredom: the war between human stubbornness and chimney smoke. Picture a small wooden cabin, rough-hewn, half buried in snow, with a slanted roof that's not quite slanted enough, and a chimney that seems to exist more for drama than function. Inside, the fire roars with ambition, but where does the smoke go? Nowhere helpful. You see, many early settler homes were not so much well ventilated as they were experimental saunas. The idea of insulation was still a bit of a myth, and aerodynamics, well, let's just say their understanding of airflow ranked somewhere below their understanding of moose migration patterns. Flames inside, frost outside, and the smoky in-between often lingered like an awkward guest. This led to the curious decision of sleeping low, as in very low, practically underground, a strategic maneuver shaped both by physics and terrible interior design. Across the snowy settlements of New England, people began to notice something remarkable. The higher you slept, the closer you got to the smoke layer. And the smoke layer had opinions. Harsh, wheezy opinions. On the other hand, if you slept closer to the floor, or dug a shallow pit in your one-room cabin's dirt floor, there was warmth, and there was breathable air. A bargain with nature that involved a bit more mud than most would prefer. Thus, the birth of what we might call smoke-level sleeping arrangements. They weren't living in bunk beds. No, bunk beds would have been a luxurious disaster in these smoky pressure cookers. But many settlers abandoned the idea of lofts entirely in winter. The romantic little sleeping platforms near the rafters quickly demoted to summer naps and squirrel storage. Instead, families cocooned themselves by the hearth, curled up in a hodgepodge of wool, furs, and what little stuffing remained inside their disillusioned featherbeds. If your imagination allows, picture 4 to 6 people bundled on the cabin floor, looking like a clump of sleepy poodles lost in a laundry basket, all while the fire smoked its way around the ceiling like a ghost who hadn't gotten the memo. To encourage the smoke to leave, a futile persuasion at best, settlers would occasionally open a door or crack a hole in the wall, just long enough to expel the worst of it. But this often resulted in a room temperature best described as yodel-inducing. The trade-off between oxygen and hypothermia was a delicate dance, and one that kept many families up at night, wide-eyed and wondering who had invented chimneys in the first place. Now, there were attempts to improve these cozy combustion chambers. Some clever, in the very loose historical sense of clever, settlers experimented with smoke hoods or crude flues made from mud daubed over sticks. But these tended to collapse whenever it rained, or snowed, or even thought about weather. So the default solution remained: stay low, breathe better, and try not to set your moccasins on fire. Sleeping below ground level wasn't just a thing for inside either. In extreme conditions, some settlers dug shallow sleeping trenches outside, lining them with evergreen boughs, hides, and irony. These were sometimes covered with makeshift lean-tos, woolen capes held aloft by sticks and hope. Because beneath the frost line, the earth stays slightly warmer. Not warm, mind you, just slightly less hostile. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. And when the choice was between a smoke-induced cough that sounded like an elk gargling porridge, or a nap nestled like a potato, between 2 damp roots, the choice became surprisingly clear. Add to this the snug ritual of sleeping closely with neighbors, children, dogs, and that one uncle who never learned the concept of personal space, and you've got the full winter tableau. Warmth by proximity, rest by necessity, and dreams scented faintly of wood smoke and old wool. Outside, the snow fell softly, the wind muttering secrets through the gaps in the walls. And inside, beneath the floating layer of smoke that moved in like an indecisive cloud, our settlers slept, a little cramped, a little damp, and entirely grounded. Somewhere just past the edge of sleep, the fire crackled again, and a fox trotted silently across the snowdrifts outside, angling its ears toward quieter things. By midwinter, the landscape wore its familiar shroud of woolly silence. Snow softened the outlines of trees, chimneys exhaled slow ribbons of smoke, and the air moved with the kind of deliberate stillness that suggested even nature wanted a nap. Amid this blessed iciness, early settlers had stumbled upon a rather unglamorous truth. Above-ground living during a northern winter was a fine way to flirt with frostbite, hypothermia, and the kind of bone chatter that turned prayer into percussion. So in their quiet genius, they took the logical next step. They went down, beneath sodden fields and cabin floors, past the roots of stubbly corn and weary turnips. Settlers dug themselves into the earth. Root cellars that once stored potatoes now played host to people. Dugouts that had begun as food shelters soon became family dens, minus the bears, though on restless nights the snoring of Uncle Silas was often mistaken for hibernation in progress. The interiors were not opulent, unless you consider dirt walls with the texture of crumbled sponge cake to be decorative, and they most certainly were. Candle soot gave them an inviting shade of Victorian dust, and the hay-stuffed mattresses on muddy pallets emitted a scent best described as barnyard aromatic with bass notes of sheep and hopes. Life underground in the winter was surprisingly survivable. The earth was a generous roommate. Just a few feet below the surface, the temperature stabilized, often lingering around the cozy range of 50 degrees Fahrenheit. A brisk autumn day by modern standards, but downright tropical when you've been splitting frost-covered firewood in your underlayers. To make these earthen hideaways somewhat habitable, settlers turned to old techniques and newer improvisations. Some would use animal skins to line the walls, in what may have been the original rustic wallpaper technique. Others went full MacGyver, wrapping hot stones in cloth and tucking them under bedding like prehistoric electric blankets, though with slightly more risk of third-degree burns. Then there was the issue of light. You'd think that deep beneath the surface, with no windows and not much ventilation, lighting would be a problem. And you'd be right. The solution: tallow candles fueled by rendered animal fat, made from creatures that once frolicked in meadows, now illuminating Aunt Mabel's riveting tales about turnip paste for gout. Surprisingly, these dark, burrowed bunkers fostered a kind of intimate, if earthy, togetherness. Families would pile in like puppies, layering themselves for warmth and comfort. The friction of everyday life, the boiling, the whisper arguing, the 4-generation snooze pile, generated its own heat. Children quickly learned that the warmest place in the dugout was between 2 snoring elders, and that if you poked the sleeping dog too hard, you'd lose prime foot space for the night. For entertainment, winter nights were long and full of talking. Oral storytelling thrived. Elders spoke in slow, cozy cadences about migrations, moon phases, and the time Ma wore both her shoes on one foot by accident during a blizzard. That story never failed an encore. There were, of course, minor inconveniences, occasional cave-ins, the odd rat who didn't mind sharing biscuits, and a pervasive mildew scent that settled into clothing with more conviction than a Sunday sermon. Yet despite all of this, it was warm, it was safe, and above all, it was quiet. The snow above wasn't just insulation, it was a hush, a soft white silence that blanketed sound and made each breath feel sacred. Even the animals seemed to approve. Chickens, who had previously refused to lay eggs in the cold, suddenly started popping them out like feathered vending machines once brought inside. One family in Upper New York even credited their donkeys' snoring with improving their baby's sleep. Unconventional lullabies, it seems, were a frontier specialty, and so the settlers endured, beneath the world, in sanctuaries of soil and straw. They redefined home not by square footage or fancy joinery, but by how well it kept out the cold and let Grandpa rattle off his theories about why squirrels were probably spies for Canada. The hearth may have been cramped, but the spirit stayed oddly high, tethered perhaps to the shared knowledge that surviving another winter meant one thing: the spring thaw would be absolutely delicious. As the snow thickened above and the candle burned low, the settlers exhaled steam in unison, sinking deeper into their earthen beds. Up above, the wind wondered where everyone had gone, and somewhere between the tick of frost and the crackle of logs, the story of underground dreams nestled into another calm, quiet night. Let's follow that gentle warmth a little further, into the strange case of the missing chimneys as the long northern winter sank its teeth into the earth, early settlers, those brave frostbitten optimists with absolutely no concept of insulation, began to realize something important. Above-ground living was an excellent way to become a human icicle. Let us stroll into a quiet December evening in the year 1711, where the wind howled like a pack of disgruntled banshees and snow fell sideways with the assertiveness of a disappointed schoolteacher. Somewhere in the back country, a settler named Bartholomew Elkins stood inside his wooden cabin, watching his breath puff out like small, polite ghosts. His cheeks were redder than shame, and his toes had long forgotten what they were for. He was seriously considering burning his only pair of trousers just for a few minutes of warmth. Bartholomew, like many others of his time, had realized through trial, error, and mild frostbite that above-ground cabins, even tightly chinked log ones, could only do so much during winter. Without modern insulation, central heating, or even the concept of double-pane anything, those cabins were little more than sophisticated wooden sieves. The wind still wormed its way in through the cracks, and heat scuttled out faster than a raccoon at sunrise. Thus emerged a cold, clammy, and entirely brilliant idea. If you wanted to survive the depths of winter, you needed to go down. Yes, down beneath the frozen crust, into the welcoming embrace of the very earth itself, and so enter the era of dugouts, sod houses, and snow-buried root cellar-style domiciles, beneath the ground bunkers of sheer practicality and earthy coziness. Digging into the frozen earth may sound like madness now, but to settlers with numb legs and dwindling candle supplies, it was a warm whisper of hope. Underground shelters offered what cabins could not: stable temperatures. While the air above danced erratically between mild frost and howling blizzard, the ground just a few feet down stayed reassuringly consistent, gritty, damp, and above all, reliably unfrozen. Of course, getting under the ground in the middle of winter wasn't for the faint of shovel. Settlers who hadn't planned ahead resorted to ingenious improvisations, or, if we're being honest, desperate grubbing. Some hollowed out hillsides and reinforced them with primitive timber frames, then stuffed every possible seam with moss, animal pelts, straw, or if necessary, last year's tax documents. One enthusiastic Ohio settler in 1793 described his winter dugout with peculiar pride. "It is warm enough for soup and dark enough to forget what day it is. The mice are polite, and my wife only curses once per day, which is an improvement." It wasn't luxury, unless you consider minimal frostbite a fair measure of opulence, but it was survival. These subterranean abodes often doubled as food storage, or occasionally as homes for more than just humans. Dogs, chickens, wandering goats named Clarence, they all wandered in seeking warmth, and with everyone snuggled elbow to elbow. It wasn't long before early Americans realized the ultimate truth of frontier sociology. Body heat is the original central heating. But while these below-ground shelters offered warmth, they came with their own eccentricities. There was humidity to contend with. Mold, of course, nature's answer to "where shall I grow today?" And occasionally, you'd wake up nose to snout with a burrowing badger who had zero interest in sharing. But settlers grinned, bore it, and perfected the art of sharing modest, muddy square footage with nature. Snuggled inside these half-subterranean dens, families played fiddle tunes, stirred slow pots of stew, and swapped stories of the outside world, a world that, until the snow melted, may as well have been on another continent. Time slowed down, priorities softened, the daily question shifted from what do we build today to which side of the goat is warmer. And in their crusty, candlelit corners, people discovered that homes weren't just built from timber or stone, but from cleverness, humor, and a shared willingness to adapt. Outside, the world grew hushed under its blanket of white. The wind rattled the trees, as if trying to remind the settlers it was still terribly in charge. But inside the earth, where little dugouts glowed faintly from flickering lanterns, there was warmth and sleep, and a slow, delicious sense of not freezing to death. And while we stretch out in our modern beds, nestled above ground with central air and memory foam, it's comforting to know that once upon a time, sleeping underground wasn't a quirky glamping choice. It was a triumph of wit over weather. As the snow continued to fall and the settlers dozed fitfully in their earthy havens, we now drift toward another curious consequence of winter living. How some pioneers turn natural features into thermal miracles with only mud, math, and the occasional disgruntled beaver. The snow had long since swallowed the clearing where a small log house huddled beneath a thick white quilt. From a polite distance, the structure might have looked abandoned, every creak or puff mute beneath the heavy snows of February. But inside, past the half-frozen shutters crusted with frost like sugared lace, the world told a different story. Imagine a low ceiling, blackened with wood smoke, a hearth so old it sighed more than it crackled, a thin bed stuffed with straw and stitched with patches from coats long outgrown. And nestled there, under the weight of shaggy wool blankets and the pressing silence of winter, were the people, layered in wool, wearing most of what they owned, and still somehow reluctant to part with their boots, even in dreams. The walls had ears, or at the very least, frost that had learned to listen. Early settlers weren't just sleeping underground because it sounded weatherproof and daring. There was something else, something quieter, something with claws. You see, above ground, in the dead cold of frontier winters, all manner of uninvited visitors stopped believing in personal space. There were raccoons plotting tiny heists in pantry corners, foxes so bold they'd paw at doors like disgruntled salesmen, and mice, oh the mice, masters of siege, warfare, whose entire winter campaigns were built on infiltrating your socks and marching squarely across your face at 2 a.m. Many settlers, faced with the evident hostility of anything with fur, took one cold, shivering look at their drafty cabins and made a unanimous decision. Let's go lower. And so they dug into hillsides or down into the snowbank itself, blending homes with the earth like clumsy moles looking for a quiet place to read. These makeshift dugouts, known less poetically as soddies or earth lodges, weren't exactly palatial. Calling them cozy might be generous unless, of course, you like your ceilings with a touch of worm activity and your walls slightly damp. But down in these earth-scooped havens, there was insulation, the kind nature gives away for free. Thick layers of soil and snow trapped warmth like a secret smile, and when the wind howled above, the underground remained hushed and steady, like the belly of a sleeping bear. Inside, families huddled together beneath animal hides, forming a sort of lumpy blanket militia, defending body heat with maternal fierceness and passive-aggressive hoarding of the warmest spots. Sometimes 2 or 3 households would share a single dugout during blizzards, and at night, you'd have to whisper your complaints just in case someone's uncle was sleeping 5 inches from your ankles. Nocturnal habits adapted quickly. People slept in shifts when fires were low, waking dizzy to stoke embers and re-wiggle toes. Food, mostly stews and thick porridges, doubled as fuel and comfort. Some seasoned their soup with stories, telling whispered tales of cities where winter meant mere inconvenience and mittens were fashion, rather than lifelines. Children listened wide-eyed, often falling asleep mid-stew, their dreams tangled with steam and snow. The art of staying warm without moving too much, this, unknowingly, they had perfected. They didn't call it hibernation, of course. That was a bear's pastime. But what settlers did, snuggled in soil-lined huts, with noses like frozen buttons and feet cross-piled under furs, wasn't far off. Entire nights passed without a stir, just slow breaths in shared darkness, the occasional scrape of mouse claws above, and maybe, but only maybe, the hint of an owl hooting from some cold Protestant tree. And it wasn't just practicality, it was symbiosis. To live with the land in winter, you practically had to crawl inside it. They weren't homeowners. They were tenants of the hillside, paying rent in soot, soup fat, and restraint from complaining too loudly when it leaked. If you looked hard enough, dugout dwellings told their own stories. Finger marks in soot near the entrance, a handprint on the ceiling, left there by someone taller who once stood up too quickly, a child's attempt at drawing the family chicken using only charcoal and wishful thinking. These were not homes in the sense of chandeliers and tea sets. They were survival dens, sprinkled with the quiet artistry of human endurance. And yet, despite the snug layers and soil-warmed walls, winter sleep never felt quite finished. Always poised, 1 foot ready for firewood dashes or midnight evacuations due to unexpected snake guests. Yes, even underground welcomed confusion. Settlers never truly escaped nature in winter. They simply shared its bed. As the snow muffled the world above and the stars turned silently behind a veil of clouds, the dugouts pulsed faintly with life. The heartbeat of a season endured, and in the darkness, someone rolled over, sighed, and pulled the blanket up once more, the rustle almost a lullaby. Down there, under the snow and among the roots, humans dreamed whatever warmth could be borrowed from sleep itself. And just as that dream begins to deepen, a strange discovery in the next morning's frost would change everything. As winter's breath began to hiss through the eaves of frontier cabins, every creaking, timber seemed to whisper one thing: stay low. Not because the roof was about to collapse, though some of them absolutely were, but because the lower to the ground you were, the better your odds of waking up with your fingers still attached. Strange as it may sound to the modern ear, wrapped in central heating and flannel pajamas, early settlers in North America believed, with both scientific suspicion and folksy confidence, that the key to surviving winter lay below eye level. Picture a settler's cabin in late January. Snow drifted up to the windows, not down from the sky, but horizontally, with the bitterness of a scolded librarian. The fire sputtered like it was bored of trying. And in the corner, yes, that corner, there protruded a staircase of packed earth leading not up but down beneath the floorboards. That was the snug sanctuary, the winter burrow. Most people today think of cellars as places for wine, regrets, or potatoes. But for many early colonists, these underfloors became makeshift bedrooms, complete with straw mats, moth-eaten quilts, and whatever livestock refused to sleep elsewhere. A cow makes an excellent space heater, provided you don't mind the fragrance of hay and cow. The philosophy was simple. Heat rises, but so does death if you try to sleep in it. Above ground, temperatures plunged to fingertip freezing lows, and insulation was often whatever you could pin to a wall, sometimes literally. Old newspapers made excellent drafts dodgers, and evangelical pamphlets found new purpose, lining walls to block the wind. This, incidentally, is why the phrase fire and brimstone occasionally appeared toasted in reverse on settler elbows. But underground, life slowed its heartbeat. There, the earth itself offered a steady, chilly embrace, a strange combination of discomfort and salvation. The temperature several feet below ground stayed relatively stable, hovering near the upper 30s or lower 40s Fahrenheit, which may not sound cozy, but compared to the glacial air above, felt alarmingly balmy. Family members would descend each evening trailing candles and persistent sniffles. They built nests of patched linens and, this is no joke, sometimes shared sleeping sacks, the colonial precursor to group snuggling. The eldest bore the inside floor, the warmest spot, while the youngest or loudest snorer often found themselves next to the root vegetables. An unplanned punishment, perhaps, but one that came with the reward of warmer carrots. Living underground for the season also had subtle psychological effects. Daylight was a rare commodity, and many settlers developed what was later understood to be seasonal affective disorder. Back then, it was described as inward frostiness of soul, treatable primarily through more stew and occasional shouting. Entertainment options were limited, so storytelling became the hearthfire of the mind. Elderly relatives told tales of England, or of the time the raccoon nearly took Aunt Betsy's toe. People laughed. Sometimes they pretended to laugh for warmth. Everyone pretended not to notice the mushrooms growing out of one corner. In truth, these winter bunkers were rarely architecturally approved, but they were expressions of the human instinct to burrow when the world goes cold. Some were elaborate, dug beneath the house like secret lairs. Others hastily scraped pits with roof planks dropped over them. A shovel was a more essential tool than a musket in many cases. After all, one prepares less often to fight bears than simply outlive the month of February. By spring, these subterranean spaces became habitats for mice, regrets, and long-forgotten mittens. Families emerged blinking into the muddy sunlight, slightly paler, somewhat smellier, but largely intact. Grateful once again for a season they barely survived, while barely sleeping above dirt level. Of course, this tradition of sleeping like a root vegetable eventually waned. With time came new technologies, better insulation, iron stoves, even glass that didn't shatter at the first puff of brisk wind. But those early colonists left behind a legacy, a quiet philosophy that when the world gets cruel, you go small, go downward, and wait it out with soup and stories. And as the winter deepened outside the creaking shingled roofs, there was one more practice settlers viewed as essential to wintertime sanity: the practice of listening. Stretching out beneath the packed earth ceiling, they would strain to hear nothing. No wolves, no wind through broken panes, just the soft breaths of those nearby, alive and sharing warmth. A silence earned, not given. But while most cozied beneath the floorboards, there were a strange few who took to more elevated approaches, even literal ones. The question is, why would anyone try to sleep above ground in the most bone-chilling months of the year? Well, that's another soft and peculiar story. By the time the wind began to rattle the shutters like an impatient ghost and snow crept in sideways through every unsuspecting seam of the cabin, most settlers knew it was time to vanish downward. Not upward, to a loft or a second floor, but downward, under the floorboards, under the straw, under reason itself. Now, calling it a cellar might summon images of proper bricks, shelves lined with preserves, perhaps a nice chair and a cat that won't stop staring at corners. But many early American winter dwellers would have laughed tiredly, frostily, at such romantic notions. Their underground shelters were more of the dirt and prayer variety. Places with ceilings so low, you had to pick which vertebra to sacrifice. Places that whispered with draughts and housed the odd turnip in every corner, like a vegetable surveillance program. Still, these frost bunkers had their wisdom. Above ground, a winter storm could go on for days. 3 feet of snow on the roof turned any home into the inside of a refrigerator someone had forgotten to plug in. The early clapboard cabins were charmingly porous, as though built by someone trying to encourage a relationship with nature, which is all very poetic until your feet begin to freeze to the floorboards. And so, when December arrived with its ice moustaches and January followed with nose icicles and bitter intentions, many households transitioned to the underground life. Families would descend into earthen dugouts insulated with straw, animal skins, and, if you were very lucky, a leftover piece of canvas from a wagon cover. In these subterranean pockets, the air was still, pungent, and, mercifully, just above freezing. Humans, goats, and an argumentative chicken or two would huddle together in a living clump of survival. Grandmothers mumbled stories while half-asleep toddlers mistook goat legs for pillows. It was, by all accounts, the coziest chaos ever sanctioned by temperature. Let's not forget lighting. Fire was dangerous. Inside these compact burrows, what with the abundance of dry straw, furs, and exhausted dreams, candles were precious, used sparingly. So most long winter nights were spent in near darkness, breathing in rhythms and listening to the quiet symphony of snores from every species present. The sheer warmth generated by shared breath and potato-stewed digestion was enough to keep the frost politely waiting at the ceiling. Meanwhile, above ground, blizzards went about their aerial business, snapping tree limbs, hurling snow haphazardly through the cracks in chimneys, and occasionally swallowing an outhouse whole. It was not unheard of for settlers to wake up underground in their snug, straw-smelling haven, only to find their world 3 feet deeper in whiteness. Several families in New England recall, or at least boast, of digging their way upwards through packed snow, using nothing but a ladle and stern determination. Clothing was another strategy in this ongoing feud with nature. Each layer was a decision. Underwear, usually woolen and slightly itchy, followed by a linen chemise that never felt entirely dry, and then an animal skin coat, sometimes still making eye contact. There were socks of every length, some too small, others long enough to flirt with your kneecaps. Children, being small and conveniently stackable, were often bundled into existing clothing rather than given new garments. In many homes, the youngest would be swaddled and inserted into the warming pan, like some sort of communal bedtime pastry. But perhaps no symbol of the era's underground coziness was more misunderstood than the humble featherbed. Rare, heavy, and full of personality, featherbeds were not so much mattresses as commitment devices. Once in, you didn't so much sleep on it as within it. One simply sank, like a medieval marshmallow, into 15 inches of down fluff that had the gravitational pull of a black hole. Getting out required at least 3 family members and a rope. And so the days passed quietly beneath layers of fabric, dirt, snow, and dreams. Farming folk found themselves living not atop the land, but beneath it, like history's coziest root vegetables. They were patient. They told stories. They waited for birthdays to slip by so they could reuse the candle on the next occasion, which would typically be someone else's birthday, or a particularly delicious-looking turnip. Above them, winter ruled in its icy, indiscriminate fashion. But underground, tucked into the straw-stuffed silence, humans persisted, not flamboyantly, but with that gentle, practical stubbornness that time so admires. And as the wind howled like a discontented banshee with a frozen nose, the curled-up settlers would sleep, warm, cramped and confused, but safe, until something peculiar began to stir just outside their subterranean door, far beneath a quilt of snow that reached windowsills like an over-eager guest overstaying its welcome. The quiet drama of winter survival played out in the most unexpected of underground living rooms. Picture a settler in the 18th century American frontier, nodding sagely as he points at the frosted horizon and mutters, "Above ground, not if I value my toes." While today we might marvel at radiant heating and triple-paned windows, the early settlers had no such luck or insulation. The cold wasn't just inconvenient, it was an ambitious burglar trying to rob your life one breath at a time. So, like bears with blueprints, these settlers dug in, literally. Earth, moody, chilly, crumbly earth, wasn't just dirt underfoot. It was insulation, habitat, and survival strategy wrapped into one muddy miracle. That's how the underworld, meaning the one beneath your own backyard, became the luxury suite of the 1700s. They called them dugouts, though it's unclear if settlers meant that literally, or if it was just an expression of deep exasperation. You'd think life underground would be bleak, but for many families, their earthen dens were warmer and cozier than the drafty cabins above. Now, when we say cozier, keep expectations pleasantly grounded, sometimes literally on the floor. These dugouts were often equipped with just enough elbow room for a family of 5 and every chicken you've ever met. You'd step down, carefully, because stairs were more of a suggestion, into a low-ceilinged space carved into a hillside or flat plain, with walls of packed clay and a roof made of sod, logs, or whatever happened to not blow away in last week's blizzard. On the brighter side, there wasn't much wind down there, and when winter roared across the plains like a frosty banshee, those who lived below ground felt only a polite rattling, a muffled howl, and maybe a surprised mouse or two stumbling into the wrong hibernation spot. Of course, this arrangement offered unique family bonding opportunities, like sharing elbow space with livestock and playing the exciting game of what's that smell and has it always been there. Yet, despite occasional surprise mushrooms and the occasional issue with drainage, see also the Great Slop Footing incident of 1739, families preferred snug, warm dugouts to brittle, icy cabins that cracked and creaked like unsure social invitations. And oh, the ingenuity. These were not modern basements with carpet and ping-pong tables. These were hand-dug havens lined with woven grass mats, wool quilts, and whatever pieces of old furniture could squeeze through the entrance. Families used a small central hearth to cook stew and warm fingers, but ventilation was a learning curve. Many learned, through trial and smoke, that chimneys were less optional design features and more absolute requirements for breathing. But the key to comfort wasn't just heat, it was silence. Underground, the wind died into whispers. No rattling shutters, no slamming doors, and no snow crawling under the roof to tap politely at your forehead at 3 a.m. It was calm, perhaps the calmest place to dream of spring. And speaking of dreams, if you ever doubted the imagination of a settler, keep in mind the multi-room upgrade. Yes, some pioneers, drunk on optimism and possibly fermented cabbage, expanded their dugouts to include tiny separate rooms. Parents slept in one pocket of clay, children in another. Chickens, of course, had their own awkward annex where they clucked through the night like feathery dream advisors. Curiously, these hovels of hardship were also places of play. Children made dolls from corn husks and dreams. Adults huddled by thin candlelight, swapping stories with that humming half-laughter of people determined to stay alive with style. Some sang old country songs, others told suspiciously embellished tales of the ghost coyote of Cedar Ridge, who may or may not have borrowed someone's mittens. So yes, the settlers slept in dirt, wrapped in wool, shivering slightly but wrapped in a warmth that only community and courageous necessity can provide. Being underground wasn't just about avoiding cold. It was about choosing connection over exposure, familiarity over frostbite, and a steady 50-something degrees over the seductive but dangerous glamour of above-ground living. And as pine-scented winds drift across fields silvered with moonlight, you can imagine those families below, listening to the crackle of their simple fires, hearts steady with the comfort of knowing that winter would not find them easily tonight. Just over the next rise, the snow-soft world prepares for another chapter of survival, and in the hush of underground twilight, new stories begin to unfurl. The wind outside howled like a homesick fiddle, draped in snow and regret. But beneath the earth, quite literally under the roots of trees and the bluster of winter's tantrum, a handful of early settlers were spending their January in a most curious way. Not in cabins, not even in tents, but tucked beneath the ground, inside what they called dugouts. Now, when one thinks of early pioneers, it's easy to imagine hardy souls chopping wood in rhythmic synchronization, flannel draped over shoulders, snowflakes artfully landing on noble brows. But, surprise, many of them spent their first few winters as human mole people. And why? Because building a full wooden house is a tad inconvenient when your hands are frozen and you're too busy not dying. A good dugout could be carved into a hillside in a weekend, give or take a blizzard. And while it might look, from the outside, like a suspicious dirt smudge with a door frame, it offered two very important things: stability and warmth. Think of it as the 19th century version of a hobbit hole, but with more frostbite and fewer birthday parties. Inside, things would be dim, of course. Dugouts weren't known for their open concept design or south-facing light. Flame-lit lanterns gave off a flickering, buttery glow, casting dancing shadows across soot-stained walls. Some of these walls were reinforced with wooden beams, others with nothing but prayer. They were often partially lined with whatever materials settlers had salvaged: canvas sails from wagons, the bones of failed projects, or, in very optimistic cases, wallpaper that insisted, maybe we'd live like this on purpose. Within these cozy caves, families would hibernate like sleepy bears with opinions. Parents, children, and sometimes even chickens, all sharing breath and space beneath a low ceiling and the insulating embrace of packed earth. Chickens, by the way, were not just livestock, but an excellent source of ambient heat. They were like little feathered hot water bottles with attitude. Life underground had its, let's say, quirks. For one, privacy was a theory, not a practice. When your bedroom overlaps with your dinner table and someone's leaning against the pantry at all hours, you learn to ignore things like your brother's midnight cheese burps or your mother's humble snoring, which gently resembled a distant avalanche. But settlers discovered things in those earthen homes, quiet lessons that weren't in any almanac. How packed snow could muffle the world into silence, how warmth layered in wool, livestock, and lullabies, and how, when the wind above screamed its icy chorus, the ground below remained impossibly still, like it too was trying not to wake the children. Of course, Not all dugouts were equal. Some were marvels of underground engineering, with stone fireplaces, root cellars, even shelves carved from the wall. Others were less luxurious, a sort of lumpy compromise with nature that said, "We'll just snuggle through the western expansion, thanks." One inventive settler family in Nebraska reportedly added a chimney made from an old stovepipe and the lid of someone's broken washtub. It worked, mostly. Except when the wind reversed course and smoke filled the dugout like a foggy saloon with fewer poker games and more coughing fits. Still, there was an art to it. A strange poetry in the way settlers crafted homes out of absence, tunneling into the earth not to hide, but to survive. With each inch dug, there was hope, a reluctant patience, a belief that one day they'd emerge into the thaw with stronger walls and better plans. And perhaps most charming of all was their suspicion of sleeping above ground in the dead of winter, up there, with sky, with all that open, unprotected space for the cold to sneak in and steal a person's nose clean off their face. No thank you, ma'am. Below ground, your nose stayed where it belonged. So when the wind hissed and ice laced its fingers through the prairie grass above, settlers below wrapped themselves tighter in patchwork quilts, listened to the fire crackle, and found comfort not in drywall or luxury, but in proximity to each other, to the land, and to the quiet rhythms of survival. And so, as the fire dimmed and the chickens gently shuffled in their sleep, there was peace, not opulence, not ease, but warmth in its most elemental form. Now then, while the world above starts to thaw and thoughts of spring gingerly tiptoe across the frost, let's drift deeper into the homes that rose after dugouts, when people dared to dream of chimneys that didn't backtalk. By the time the winds turned sharp and the trees stood like frozen dancers wrapped in icy lace, the early settlers of the northern frontier had entered what can only be described as their annual game of hide and hibernate. Over generations, they became expert underground dwellers, mole people with waistcoats and very practical snow boots. Now, it's tempting to imagine these settlers choosing their subterranean winter living quarters out of sheer ancestral romance, guided by traditions passed down from fur-hatted great-grandfathers. But the truth was a bit more desperate and drafty. Above-ground dwellings, those quaint log cabins we now associate with sipping cider beside a roaring hearth, were notoriously bad at containing heat. Built quickly from roughly cut wood seasoned by prayer and impatience, these cabins had more gaps than a gossip's diary. In even a modest wind, your average settler could feel the drafty opinion of Mother Nature right through the floorboards. And so, many settlers turned to the earth itself, not just for potatoes and vaguely threatening root vegetables, but for shelter. They dug into hillsides, riverbanks, and even the flat, reluctant prairie like determined badgers with a construction permit. These dugouts, or soddies, became winter sanctuaries, whether temporary or, in some cases, alarmingly permanent. Inside these earthen dens, temperatures hovered just above freezing. Not exactly a tropical oasis, but far preferable to the frostbitten wind chill above. There was a certain coziness to it all, if you ignored the occasional leaking ceiling and startled mole. The thick walls of dirt insulated better than any log wall, and with a properly banked fire and enough blankets to smother a mammoth, a family might pass a tolerable, if subterranean, season. Let's not sugarcoat it, though. These were not the Pinterest-perfect hobbit homes of modern fantasies. There were no round doors, no pots of tea conveniently steeping on stone hearths. No one asked for second breakfast unless they were delirious with fever. There were bugs, there were smells. And on more than one occasion, curious livestock discovered a way in, causing a controversial period when some communities debated whether goats could be considered long-term roommates. Still, despite, or perhaps because of, the earthiness of it all, these underground habitats offered a singular peace. Snow muffled the world above, conversations echoed less, and sleep came more quickly. Perhaps because once darkness fell, every candle became precious, and every bit of warmth sacred. Even the manner of sleep itself changed. Sharing beds was common not just for warmth, but also for conspiracy against the cold. Mothers, fathers, children, and occasionally the cat would bundle into bed like hibernating raccoons, forming what naturalists might call a family pile. Privacy was discarded along with any aspiration of turning on one side. It was warmth or bust. One settler journal from Minnesota, dated 1843, includes a charming, albeit slightly bitter entry. Stayed below again today. Apples froze to the shelf above our heads. Pa insists it's bracing, but Ma says next year she'll dig a hole so deep Pa won't come out till tulips bloom. It's a historical gem, preserved in faded ink and spite. Interestingly, the decision to sleep below ground sparked more than just architectural adaptations. Some settlers began constructing half dugouts, where only the back portion of the home tunneled into earth, while the front featured a facade of log framing, and, occasionally, a window if someone got particularly ambitious with glass. These hybrid shelters combined the thermal benefits of buried living with just enough verticality to keep humans feeling marginally superior to voles. This unofficial architectural movement, sometimes called Prairie Gothic, but more often just called good enough, enabled clever families to balance comfort and dignity while fending off frostbite and humility. The more luxurious versions included shelves sculpted from packed clay, straw-covered floors, and even makeshift chimneys constructed from whatever metal could be gilded into shape. Such ingenuity is easy to romanticize now, but make no mistake, when your roof caved in due to snow weight and you had to spend the afternoon shooing away curious ferrets, it took a special kind of pioneer optimism not to move to Florida immediately. Yet come spring, the dugout believers would rise again, blinking like squinting marmots into the long-awaited sun. And while they'd patch up their above-ground cabins, plant seeds, build fences, and welcome the thaw, many already had next winter's nesting site in mind. After all, during the coldest months, the ground didn't just cover them, it held them in its quiet arms. And somewhere under that thick blanket of soil, secrets of survival took root, along with a few forgotten potatoes, which, gently turning in their sleep beside the boots, are about to come in handy once more. Some say winter brings out the worst in people, and by some, we mean early settlers who, by January, had memorized the exact angle at which every rafter creaked, the smell of everyone's socks, and the subtle, delicate art of not punching Uncle Gregory when he whistled in his sleep. By midwinter, above-ground life became less of a lifestyle and more of an act of stubborn defiance, bravado wrapped in itchy wool. The great wooden longhouses or hand-hewn cabins, which had seemed charmingly rustic in September, took on all the inviting atmosphere of a chilled casket by February. The walls, blasted thin by thrift and necessity, did little to stop what some settlers poetically called the kind of cold that slices soup. Windows were often wax paper, if you were lucky, or literal holes with dreams attached, and all that fancy firewood you chopped in your summer optimism burned through by December 12th. If you didn't panic shave the chairs first, even fire, that ancient friend with its cheery crackle, barely stood up to what the wind had in mind. Most fires were more metaphor than heat source, spiritual centerpieces to sit around and reminisce about a time when your fingers still felt like yours. It was around this time each winter, somewhere past the first snowfall and well before any thaw dared show up, that settlers began looking downward to the cellars. You know, the frozen preserve pits, root basements and other, and underground hidey holes initially designed to keep pumpkins fresh, not people. But when above-ground life meant frostbitten pinky toes every morning, sleeping underground, beneath packed soil, straw insulation, and thick stone walls, started to sound less like desperation and more like genius. Picture it, a slope leading down through a crude wooden hatch, earthen stairs that creaked less than the floorboards above, air filled with the scent of half-buried turnips and something faintly pickle-adjacent. It might not be glamorous, but down there, the temperature remained stubbornly above freezing. Dignity not included. Families would dig out the root cellars just enough to lay down straw bedding, huddle up like spoons in a drawer, and breathe in the musky warmth of survival and questionable onions. Compared to the wind howling through the gaps above, the underground soon took on the emotional profile of a luxury spa, if the spa was run by potatoes. And then there was the matter of smell. No, not the family itself. Though after a week underground, let's just label the atmosphere as agriculturally marinated. We're talking about the scents of root vegetables, parsnips, beets, and potatoes stacked like hibernating sentinels of bland survival. There's an oddly comforting perfume to that. Earthy, mild, undeniably starchy. Some claimed it had medicinal properties, though most remedies of the time involved enthusiastic beliefs and absolutely no scientific testing. The cellar also offered a quaint sort of democracy. Upstairs, you might have had rolls. Mother cooked, father chopped wood, little Timmy chased the bat out of the chimney. But underground, everyone was equally cold, equally bundled, equally aware that the ceiling above them was freshly dug dirt, and the last living thing buried down here had a stem. But this communal experience fostered more than warmth. It knit families together in uncomfortable proximity. Quentin's snoring became a nightly lullaby. Aunt Myrtle's foot-warming techniques, questionable above ground, earned her legendary status in subterranean lore. The rationing of lamp oil encouraged storytelling, the kind that made wide eyes in the dark and might have involved exaggerated bear-related disasters. And there was a performative element to it too. Telling other settlers you were sleeping in the cellar was like announcing you'd found the cheat code of winter. "Oh, still above ground," they'd say. "Must be nice to lose feeling in your knees by sundown." In truth, sleeping underground didn't make you soft. It made you smart. It made you strategic. It made you someone unwilling to let your eyebrows frost over indoors one more time. Of course, not every cellar was created equal. Some were richly packed with preserved jams, pickled eggs, and sadness. Others were glorified root closets. Size didn't matter so much as sealing out the wind and sealing in the body heat. Preferably not from a goat. In some particularly cold seasons, entire communities would shift partially underground, creating a mole-like society with whispered greetings and shared buckets of thawed soup. No one was smiling broadly, but at least their lips weren't too cold to move. And just as settlers adapted to the earth below, the earth, in its strange way, offered a kind of silent shelter, one where the wind didn't reach, and the long white fingers of winter couldn't quite pry open the hatches. But as the days began lengthening and pipe smoke curled upward like a thawed dream, they'd soon need to venture topside again. First briefly, then boldly. Right after they figured out how to unstick their feet from the straw mattress, which, as we'll discover, was nowhere as simple as it sounded. Snow had a curious way of silencing the land. In the midwinter months of the 1700s, when the world sagged under blankets of white and the horizon was more suggestion than shape, early settlers found themselves listening more often than speaking. Footsteps disappeared in flurries, words puffed out in little ghost clouds, and arguments, well, few people had the energy to argue when keeping your eyelids from freezing shut felt like a full-time job. But below, yes, always below, something stirred warmer. Beneath the earth, down amongst root cellars, storage pits, cleverly dug out shelters, and odd-smelling woolen closets, settlers had discovered what marmots, badgers, and hermits knew instinctively. The earth refuses to panic in winter. These underground quarters weren't always roomy. Some were the width of a modest cupboard and smelled faintly of pickled herring and moist optimism. Yet, therein lay their genius. Tight quarters meant body heat did most of the heavy lifting. One person breathing overnight might raise the temperature just enough to feel like one was drifting to sleep in the depths of a gently used oven mitt. Cozy, if you ignored the radishes. You see, in the thump and mutter rhythm of colonial life, settlers didn't just build underground rooms. They furnished them with their root vegetables. Turnips the size of a child's hope. Carrots so knobby they looked like arthritic fingers frozen mid-proposal. Whole walls of squashes leaned in like old aunts, offering silent support and a mild fungal aroma. These vegetables pulled double duty. Food for later, insulation for now. That's right, squash were the original heated throw blankets. Of course, things beneath the earth weren't always serene. There was the problem of cellar critters. Mice, voles, and, on one memorable occasion, a confused raccoon named Mercutio, who, rather dramatically, refused to leave a settler's root bin without a formal invitation. Families told stories in the twilight down below. These weren't thrilling sword-flicking tales, mind you. No dragons or duels, just quiet, winding narratives about the time someone saw a hedgehog, or how Aunt Martha accidentally made jam so sticky it sealed the whole pantry shut for a week. Comfort came in consistency. If you were lucky, you got to hear stories repeated so often that you remembered how the characters smelled. There were always smells, of course. A mixture of smoked pork, damp wool, onions, and unspoken hopes. The human nose, it turns out, adjusts better than one might think. And when everyone smells slightly fermented, no one does. Old-timers insisted that dreams were warmer underground, that sleep came softer and lingered longer, like a cat unwilling to leave a sunny windowsill. Whether it was the radiant embrace of thermal mass or simply the psychological balm of surviving another day without freezing straight through to your toenails, no one was quite sure. There were curious subterranean rituals too. The ceremonial lighting of the stubby candle, each family had their own, and the evening snuggening, a highly technical term for cocooning oneself in every available blanket, coat, and sibling. The youngest child was often strategically placed in the middle, both for warmth and to prevent unauthorized midnight snack raids. And lest you think these underground dens were uniformly grim affairs, remember that settlers, those grizzled optimists in wool trousers, had an uncanny knack for joy. They played cards, hummed tunes with no beginning or end, and took immense pride in who could whistle the quietest lullaby. Above, the winds howled impatiently through the forests, rattling branches in protest of their bareness, but below, life pulsed slow and determined, like a kettle left just on the brink of boil. The nights were long, yes, but time, in an earth-warmed shelter, moved differently, softer around the edges, loose-jointed and thoughtful. And though no one clocked it at the time, something about being earth-surrounded reminded settlers that life is at its best. A bit of mud, a splash of kindness, and someone else's feet accidentally poking yours under the furred blankets. By this time of winter, even the chickens had resigned themselves to subterranean living, or more likely, had been gently encouraged into their own coop cellars. A noble hen named Henrietta was, according to various completely unverifiable accounts, known to lay eggs exclusively when sung to by candlelight. Her preferred tune? Greensleeves. Naturally. And so they stayed, tucked under the crust of the earth, hidden from wind, wolves, and worry alike. Outside, the frost crept like lace across the window panes, but down below there was warmth. Not grand, roaring fire warmth, but the quiet, uplit warmth of survival carved into soil. Soon, it would be midwinter's festival, and the appearance of something settlers took very seriously: the highly debated, incredibly homemade root vegetable lanterns. But that's a story for another flicker of flame. The sun, that bashful and infrequent visitor of a colonial winter, had long since retired behind alabaster clouds. Snow fell not with urgency, but with the calm assurance of someone who knew it had all the time in the world to blanket the earth. And beneath that spreading sea of white, early settlers burrowed into the earth like sleepy squirrels who had absolutely had it with frostbite. It might surprise you to learn that in the 1700s, living underground during winter wasn't just for mustachioed moles and weather-weary badgers. For the pale, fur-hatted frontiersmen of yore, snuggling into a subterranean dugout was less a retreat than a survival strategy wrapped in mud, moss, and the occasional squirrel roommate who refused to split firewood. The dugout, not the kind sold by sporting goods stores for camping Instagram posts, but the kind chiseled by calloused hands and pure winter panic, was often the most reliable way to stay, well, not frozen. Constructed by carving into hillsides or flat earth like over-ambitious gophers, these humble hollows were usually reinforced with logs, packed insulation like dried grasses, and occasionally sealed with a mud plaster that managed to keep the wind out and just enough heat in. It didn't hurt that earth itself was a fairly decent insulator. Get beneath the frost line, and suddenly, you're not surviving winter, you're hosting it. Of course, descending into a hole in the ground wasn't exactly glamorous. By candlelight, rough-hewn logs and walls of stubborn soil played host to all manner of scrappy furniture. A bed was often little more than a frame stuffed with dried leaves, moss, or, if you were splurging, straw that hadn't been chewed on by the neighbor's goat. The scent, a seductive mix of damp earth, unwashed socks, and hope. Ventilation, a detail often overlooked in cozy fantasy books about the frontier, was crucial. Not for ambience, but survival. Without a proper chimney or draft hole, the fireplace that kept your toes from icing over could just as easily end the whole winter prematurely with an indoor bonfire. Settlers learned quickly. Smoke is romantic in poetry, but significantly less so when it's pouring into your potato-scented living space. Ah yes, potatoes, the crown jewel of the winter pantry, followed closely by salt pork, dried beans, and anything pickled within an inch of its life. meals were less about fine dining and more about minimizing frostbite through calories. By February, stew was more philosophy than recipe, a boiling amalgamation of whatever hadn't spoiled, frozen solid, or run off. It's said that a well-made stew could keep a person warm longer than most relationships. Settlers ate early and heavily, retiring to their sleeping straw like hibernating bears, except with slightly more complaining. Life inside the dugout flowed gently in the rhythms of survival. Children played games that required neither space nor movement, including Let's Guess Where the Rat Went, and the ever-charming Who's Sitting on the Butter. Adults kept their hands busy, mending, whittling, complaining gently, and threading torn mittens while pretending it didn't feel increasingly like Antarctica outside. Neighbors, if they existed, were often a day's snowshoe trek away, which meant the winter was a masterclass in tolerance. Tolerance for your partner's snoring, for long silences, for the rhythmic drip of melting snow through a leak you swore you fixed in November. Letter writing became a passionate affair, less out of literary ambition and more out of unspent conversation. "My dearest Martha," someone might begin. "Today I watched an icicle grow for 3 whole hours." But despite the dampness, the cold, and the occasional frozen-in-place chicken, there was something soothing about the earth wrapping around you like a sleepy arm. Above ground, the wind howled through barren branches like a discontented widow. But below, in a cramped but warm cocoon of clay and fire, there was stillness, candles flickering with gentle resolution, and the quiet hum of shared breath. Outdoors, the night stretched thick and silver black. Wolves padded silently through the snow, too proud to ask settlers for stew. Stars glinted faintly through cloud wisps, a pinprick light show for anyone brave enough to peek outside without curling back into their moss-lined nap bunker. And so, the settlers laid still, buried not beneath despair, but beneath hope in layers. Hope that the frost would recede, that the potatoes would hold out, that spring would nudge its muddy fingers into the world again. But first, they would sleep, surrounded by earth, stew leftovers, and the soft sighing of winter settling in. As the wind above shuffled forward, carrying tomorrow in its arms like an overcooked casserole, something far beneath stirred. An idea, perhaps, or the clever rumbling beginnings of chapter 20. It was a surprise not just to later generations, but to many within the early colonial circles themselves, that the key to surviving the cruelest winter nights was not innovation, but regression. That's right. Burrowing underground like sleepy badgers with taxes to avoid turned out to be one of the most rational strategies available in an era where people sincerely thought powdered wigs looked authoritative. Let's softly open the creaky wooden door to a December evening in, say, 1692. A perfectly ordinary date pulled gently from the snowdrift of history. In New England, the wind was less of a breeze and more of a personal vendetta. It whipped across the barren hills with the vengeful spite of a Puritan preacher whose favorite sermon notes had blown into a creek. Snow, thick and indifferent, fell in muffling flurries, and the only thing more frosty than the trees was the relationship between the settlers and the heating technology of the period, which can best be described as aspirational. Grace Middleton, a widow of indeterminate but definitely unimpressed age, had discovered years prior that sleeping above ground in winter made your toes feel a bit too much like decorative icicles. Her solution? The humble, expertly modest earth shelter. Picture it. A shallow dugout banked into the hillside, roofed with woven saplings, kettle smoke puffing from a stone vent like a shy old dragon. The floor was packed dirt, blanketed with straw and old cloaks, and best of all, it didn't rattle in the wind like the rude above-ground cabins. Now, you may be picturing some sort of luxurious hobbit hole. Dial that expectation back several leagues. These earth homes were often called soddies or dugouts, depending on your region and how polite you were feeling about your accommodations. They were undeniably cozy in the way a warm biscuit is cozy, comforting, earthy, and perhaps a bit grainy. The science behind it all was pleasingly sensible. The ground maintains a relatively stable temperature below the frost line. That meant even as the surface froze harder than a boiled pudding left out on the sill, the subterranean nooks remained tolerably cool instead of lethally cold. The naturally insulating properties of soil were apparently more effective than the colonial wallpaper known as lots of complaining. These shelters were inexpensive too, ideal for those operating on a budget powered by barter and stubborn optimism. You just needed a shovel, some patience, and perhaps a mild disregard for indoor air quality. Chimneys, you see, were not always included. Some settlers, keen to avoid smoke inhalation or a sooty awakening, would build small smoke trenches or use slanted vent holes to pull smoke out and away. Many simply traded excess smoke for warmth, accepting a modest blackening of the ceiling, and occasionally the family cat, as payment for thermal comfort. Children, small and wriggly as they were, often became impromptu heat sources. Families would sleep huddled like penguins dressed in far more flammable attire. The mattress situation was rarely enviable, more likely to be sacks of straw than anything with springs. But warmth was shared, generously and without complaint. Well, without excessive complaint. Colonial diaries are riddled with notes like, "Jonathan's elbow found my nose again," and "Susanna must learn not to steal covers with her feet." Winter meals were prepared slowly, practically as a form of patience training. Stews were the dish of destiny. Every pot contained a mysterious medley of root vegetables, scraps of salted meat, and a hope that someone had remembered to remove the turnip tops. These slow stews lived beside low hearth fires day and night, thickening quietly, letting flavors sit down and get to know one another. Sleep came quickly after such meals, not just because of full bellies, but also thanks to the dim lighting, the torpor of winter fatigue, and likely a mild case of oxygen deficiency. Nature, too, dulled its edges. Outside, foxes moved in muffled trots, pressed deep into their tracks. The trees creaked warmly, not alarmingly, whispering secrets in a language the wind had long since forgotten. And beneath it all, tucked under layers of snow and soil, colonial families slumbered, safe, smoky, slightly sneezy, dreaming of longer days, fatter sheep, and quilts that didn't shed feathers like startled geese. Above them, the stars blinked quietly, as if making peace with their own cold. And far in the west, near the edge of memory, another community was discovering something even stranger about winter shelter, something whispering in stone and silence. But that's a tale unwrapped in the next hushed breath of history. As winter set in, and the world above turned into one long, crunchy snow globe, our early settlers disappeared into their underground worlds like drowsy badgers with tool belts. By mid-December, entire families had vacated the shivering upper crust of the earth and cozied up beneath it, stewing cabbages, carving spoons, and trying very politely not to breathe on each other too much. But while their burrowed bunkers kept their noses relatively unfrosted, another challenge emerged. less dashed with icicles and more with scratches, scuffles, and the occasional scream muffled into a quilt. The matter of personal space. Imagine it. You, your spouse, children, maybe an elderly uncle who doesn't know how loud he's chewing. And perhaps to top it all off, 3 chickens that must be accommodated indoors because the fox has figured out how doors work, cramped under 6 feet of densely packed snow, sharing an earthen hovel no wider than a generous root cellar. It didn't take long before people started discovering just how loud silence isn't. This is when the great art of passive-aggressive domestic harmony was born. Arguments were expressed in the subtle rearrangement of firewood, the depressing loudness of a sigh, or most commonly, through pointedly stirring the stew clockwise instead of counterclockwise. Everyone knew it tasted better counterclockwise. A passive stew stir was considered downright scandalous west of the Hudson. On the rare occasion, someone needed to step outside, for example, to use the necessary, rather than testing the family chamber pot spill limit. They faced a terrifying obstacle course of waist-deep snowdrifts, suspicious wolves with unresolved boundary issues, and the disappearing footprints of whoever had last ventured out and, frankly, hadn't returned. It was almost enough to make one deeply reconsider their hydration. Which brings us to the great invention of indoor winterisms. These were the sanity-saving rituals that emerged only in the coldest months and were never spoken of come spring. One popular tradition was the shadow play, a theatrical event performed using nothing but candlelight, crude hand puppets made of turnip skins, and the kind of narrative courage that could make a 9-minute story about chopping wood feel like a 3-act epic. Children squealed, adults clapped, and someone inevitably cried during the scene where the potato was sacrificed for porridge. Board games as we know them didn't quite exist, but settlers may do. Perhaps you've heard of whisker-ball, a questionable pastime involving a bit of string, a terrified mouse, and the family cat. Results varied. Another favorite was Guess That Smell, which required less setup but significantly more forgiveness. As aromatic consequences of close living became unrealistically intimate, this olfactory guessing game was part survival lesson, part diplomatic exercise. Underground life also necessitated new forms of intimacy not often practiced today. For instance, the communal sock. You might think I mean a matching bulk purchase. Oh no. I mean one sock, passed around and shared, rotated if you will, in an effort to keep 1 foot per person warm at a time. It was ridiculous. It was disgusting. It was oddly bonding. And yes, it was usually decorated with a hand-stitched phrase like, "Turn me inside out when you're done." Light was scarce. Candles were precious, and wicks were often made of things that perhaps shouldn't ever have been lit on fire. Chicken feathers, horsehair, or strings saved from flour sacks. One enterprising soul even attempted to burn dried mashed turnips like logs, which predictably resulted in a cave full of smoke and a beet cough that lingered until spring. Nonetheless, people found light where they could, moon slivers sneaking through cracks, reflections off icicles, and above all, the steady glow of human absurdity. And still, beneath it all, under the soot-dusted rafters and the trembling straw bedding, lay a deep, almost sacred stillness. It was the sound of everything slowing down, of the world turned inward, of families, awkward, eccentric, endearingly irritable, learning how to be alone together. The snow packed heavy above their roofs, the wind howled like a runtime error in nature's programming, and inside, someone hummed a song no one remembered learning. Sleep came not quickly, but earnestly, wrapped in 5 layers of wool, dipped in onion-scented dreams, warmed by the soft snores of companions and the occasional outlaw chicken. It was a sleep that belonged not to comfort, but to resilience. A lullaby scored in silence, whittled from hardship, and probably interrupted once or twice for someone needing to use the outside again. But even in the stifling stillness, something stirred, an idea, a plan, something designed not underground, but high above the snowline, where stars watched and icicles listened. And if you listen carefully, you might just hear it too, gently beckoning towards something just beginning to rise. In the deeper hush of winter, when snow draped itself across the land like a goose feather quilt dumped by a careless sky, early settlers above the 45th parallel began to reconsider the romanticism of log cabins, particularly the myth that cabins, being made of wood, must naturally provide warmth. A charming idea, of course, until your mug of pine needle tea turns into a pine needle popsicle overnight. The truth, those celebrated homesteads were often draftier than a politician's campaign promises. By late January, many settlers had reached a quiet, frostbitten understanding with the elements. Warmth was no longer a luxury, it was a strategy, and above ground, warmth was losing. A curious solution emerged, equal parts desperation and ingenuity. Some began to dig, not metaphorically, but quite literally. They chipped through the frozen surface of the earth with whatever they had. Repurposed shovels, broken axe heads, bits of old wagon wheel. It was less of an architectural plan and more of a frostbitten improvisation. What resulted were shelter dugouts, subterranean hovels that resembled overgrown badger dens, but with more ambition and slightly fewer manners. The earth, as it turns out, was the unlikeliest of allies. Beneath the frozen topsoil, temperatures dropped not with the wind, but with the rhythm of geology. It kept to a consistent chill, a nippy 40 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, which, in comparison to the world outside, felt positively tropical. Settlers would crawl into these earth-dug burrows at sundown, armed with candle stubs, rattling tin cups, and the tentative hope that their eyelids might defrost by morning. Despite their snugness, these humble dugouts came with quirks. There were the soil crumbles during the night, small, dusty avalanches that could give a man a muddy mustache in his sleep. Then there was the unmistakable scent, part damp hymn book, part overcooked turnip, and part mystery. And the ever-present condensation meant that everything perpetually sported a gentle dew, as though the whole world had just sneezed. These underground sanctuaries weren't just practical. They were profoundly democratic. Everyone, regardless of how large their Leyden jar collection or cow count, could dig into the thermal embrace of the earth. Walls of compacted soil didn't care if you were a preacher, a trapper, or a deeply confused poet fleeing civilization because you once misread an Emily Dickinson verse. And the furnishings? Oh, they very much existed. A wooden crate for a stool, a dangling lantern for mood lighting, and if you were truly high society, a corner shelf dug into the dirt where you could proudly display your one surviving tin plate and that weird blue button that had followed your family from Prussia to Pittsburgh before ending up next to a rotting turnip. At night, hushed voices drifted from dugout to dugout, muffled by snow and soil. Sometimes the settlers whispered prayers, sometimes ghost stories, often just complaints about the impossibility of drying wool socks inside a burrow. Children scratched tic-tac-toe into the walls, sharing sour apples and optimism in equal measure. Dogs curled up at feet, not so much out of affection, more of a hostage situation for body heat. But perhaps the most delightful aspect of these sub-earth cocoons was their uncanny acoustics. Every cough, every creak of a wooden spoon echoed faintly in the low dome. Burrow opera, if you will. Especially when Grandpa attempted his late-night hummed rendition of God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, which tended to sound like a sleepy toad with delusions of grandeur. And there, nestled within their earthbound pods, settlers finally slept, not luxuriously, but steadily. The howl of the wind was muffled. The snowstorm became a distant rumor, and somewhere deep beneath the frost line, lungs exhaled steam into the soft dark, warmed by the belly of the earth itself. By spring, many of these dugouts would be abandoned in favor of less crumbly options. But in midwinter, they stood as quiet proof that survival often wears its coziest pajamas underground. The earth had held them safe, and just above, frost clung to the branches like sequins on a forgotten ballroom gown, catching moonlight no one saw, while sleep wound its way into every crevice and corner and quiet breath. As sleet begins to whisper on the roof of the world, let's follow the story further. Gently, in the soft hush of snow-muted wilderness, when the wind outside howled like a discontented librarian shushing the entire forest, early settlers of North America discovered a curious truth. Winter did not merely arrive. It descended, conquered, and redecorated their lives entirely. Picture it, a young settler couple, elbows deep in the delightful processes of fermenting cabbage and wondering if their neighbor had frozen standing up again. Life above ground, with its creaking cabins and drafty dreams, had grown a touch frosty. The logs in their timber homes shrank in the bitter cold. Gaps between beams whispered secrets to the wind, and chimneys seized up with soot and sorrow. Blankets, though lovingly stitched and possibly blessed by 7 grandmothers, simply weren't enough. So what did our clever ancestors do? Well, they went underground. Literally. Earth, you see, is nature's most underappreciated HVAC. A few feet below the surface, the temperature remains surprisingly steady, cool in summer, and crucially, not lethally cold in winter. Entire families would retreat to dugouts, or soddies, as they were sometimes called, carved right into hillsides or beneath thick layers of turf. These weren't the cavernous stone palaces of fairy tales, but squat, earthy pockets, half den, half determined wish to survive. Inside it was dim, low-ceilinged, always slightly damp, as though the walls were perpetually whispering, "Don't get too cozy." But compared to the glacial drafts upstairs, it was paradise. Provided paradise includes an oven made of clay and an occasional badger roommate. Some settlers, ever the innovators, constructed what could generously be described as basement bedrooms beneath existing cabins, with trapdoors hidden beneath hide rugs or overachieving piles of firewood. Families would descend with candles in one hand and stew pots in the other. They didn't just sleep underground. They cooked, worked, played, and occasionally sulked down there. Children grew skeptical of the sun's existence. Dogs grew fond of root vegetables, and family arguments muffled by earthen walls achieved unprecedented levels of privacy. But perhaps the oddest, and we say this knowing full well early settlers once fermented bear fat for soap, was the way these subterranean shelters changed family dynamics. Everyone, regardless of their usual social roles, was crammed into the same low-lit, root vein-covered quarters. Teenage sons lost the moody elegance of slamming doors. Grandmothers, previously confined to rocking chairs, found themselves leaning over smoky cook fires and rediscovering their old wrestling injuries. Privacy was replaced with proximity, and the scent of turnip stew hung heavy like a low-hanging fog of compromise. By necessity, people got very good at quiet coexistence. Snoring was choreographed. Breathing patterns were analyzed with scientific rigor. One can only imagine a young settler, lying wide-eyed beside 6 siblings, carefully timing each exhale to avoid overlapping with father's spirited nasal escapades. But the underground winter lifestyle wasn't just about staying warm. It was about preserving life itself. Above ground, frostbite waited like a punctual guest. Food would freeze solid within minutes. Ink cracked in pens, and eyelids, if left unchecked, might become unwilling ice sculptures. Underground, amid the musty comfort of potato bins and sleeping geese, survival became a kind of awkward art, and the artist, unshaven, sleep-deprived, but oddly cheerful in their woolen cocoons. You must understand, these were not people who luxuriated in hardship. No, they shrugged into it like a poorly fitted overcoat and got on with the business of outlasting the winter. And they did it with whatever means they could patch together. Abandoned barrel lids for doors, moss insulation stuffed lovingly into roof gaps, and floors reinforced with hope, mostly. So through the coldest nights, families huddled in these soil-bedded shelter nests, kitchens mere feet from beds, chickens roosting like old books on shelves. The sounds were soft and intimate, wood softly creaking, someone muttering about beans, the wind above thudding helplessly against the sleeping earth. In that stillness, people learned to endure, to whisper rather than shout, to dream, even if the dream smelled faintly of onions and damp wool. And so they waited, for spring, for thaw, for the sweet return of awkward door hinges and the audacity of sunlight. And as the night stretched long, the frost mattered a little less, because below ground, in their strange burrowing way, they were warm, they were alive, they were home. Let's keep our lantern lit just a little longer. There's one final flicker waiting in the dark, while snow lightly gathered on the curled edges of thatched rooftops and wolves pondered moral dilemmas off in the distant woods, as wolves are wont to do in a bedtime story. Our early settlers, gritty, inventive, and fairly allergic to frostbite, had long since learned to retreat beneath the surface. Not emotionally, mind you, but physically, under the ground. The good old-fashioned winter cellar, not just a storage space for turnips and questionable cider anymore, but a cozy place to survive the months where your breath froze mid-gossip. Cold as an ex-mother-in-law's stare and twice as persistent, winter didn't just nip at their heels, it gnawed on anyone foolish enough to insist on sleeping above ground. You see, sleeping underfoot was more than practical. It was practically an art form. Settlers layered straw atop stone, pressed hay into the walls like nature's insulation, and sealed gaps with mud so enthusiastically that modern archaeologists are still finding fingerprints. Fireplaces were tucked in snug like well-behaved puppies, and a bed might well consist of animal pelts, woolen blankets, and dreams of a springtime that stubbornly refused to RSVP. Our ancestors weren't just enduring winter, they were managing it with flair. Take the example of silent, soot-smudged cabin architects in New France, who designed their semi-subterranean bunkers with ceilings low enough that standing up required signing an injury waiver. And yet, in that squat shell of safety, families told stories by candlelight, roasted salted fish with brazen optimism, and occasionally won impromptu snoring contests. Even household pets got in on the underground action. Cats nestled in pockets of warmth beneath skirts, and dogs. Oh, the dogs. They didn't so much lie next to people as pretend they were people, taking up entire corners by the hearth and sighing, theatrically, when asked to shuffle over. One particularly well-documented case from 1782, though well-documented might be an exaggeration, mentions a Newfoundland named Thistle, who insisted on having her own quilt. She was indulged, naturally. In colder colonies, like those of the Hudson's Bay Company, where temperatures reached numbers normally reserved for planetary moons, the underground shelter wasn't just recommended, it was survival. Workers hunkered down in fur-lined dugouts, heated rocks on stoves only slightly more advanced than enthusiastic piles of logs, and drank tea brewed in kettles that protested every morning like hungover songbirds. And perhaps it's true that winter underground living wasn't glamorized in paintings or ballads. You won't find many swooning portraits of a family eating boiled root stew beside a damp clay wall, while someone tries to convince a chicken to stop nesting in the butter churn. But there is a quiet majesty in the ingenuity of it all. There were rules, of course. For example, never, under any circumstance, fall asleep with your wet boots on, unless your idea of a good time is waking up unsure whether your socks still have a future. And if you had to brave the upper realms, by which we obviously mean the regular floor of your cabin, always keep a foot looped into the stair rope. Many a drowsy settler wandered half asleep into the blizzardy beyond, while trying to find the loo. And so, winter after winter, nestled beneath the frostbitten landscape, people adapted, not with grandeur, but with grit. They became experts at heat conservation, at patience, and, remarkably, at togetherness, because in those inches of warmth carved into the earth, families played fiddle tunes on homemade instruments, blew smoke rings near the chimney, and muttered prayers that the preserves wouldn't explode again. Some might say this was the birthplace of cozy, of hygge. Before Scandinavians copyrighted it in wool, it was the pre-electric, practically pre-everything version of snug. A bunkhouse under the hill, 2 children snoring like geese, a warm pup in your lap, and a pot of stew with more hope than seasoning. Outside, snow kept quietly winning awards for most dramatic seasonal performance. Inside, beneath floorboards and time, the settlers simply slept, safe in the cradle of the earth, hidden from the wind's sharp gossip. And now, perhaps, you too can rest. Your world, like theirs, quieter tonight. Drift gently into the hush below the frost. Let the cold stay outside where it belongs, and let sleep rise slowly, like steam from a hidden kettle long ago.